horsemen, and the truth about our world. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. And we'll be reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 6. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and find that now. Revelation, chapter 6. And I'll offer a few comments while you do that. So tonight, we have to work hard to resist some typical but wrong ways of reading Revelation. And so let me remind us, a little refresher here of some of our first 2 weeks of studying the book of Revelation. We're reading this book as a cascade of images, not as a linear timeline of a sort of allegory where A stands for B and X stands for Y, and all of it is one grand prediction of the chronology of events at the end of time and the end of the world. No, it's not how the early church read it, and it's not how most Christians read it today. So remember, that method is only about 100 years old. It's peculiar to the U.S. It's called dispensationalism. And so we're not reading it in that way. We're going to take this other way. And so instead, we are adopting an impressionistic mode of reading, where we're trying to remain open to the emotional and spiritual and psychological and even artistic impressions that this writing has upon us, much like our own dreams. And so that's what we want to tap into as we read, those impressions. And another thing we want to tap into, and a little more review here, is what these passages would have meant to their original audience. The Christians in the first century, many of whom had converted from Judaism. And so we let these passages call up in our minds relevant Old Testament passages, because the first readers, of course, knew their Hebrew scriptures well. So Jesus himself often made these kinds of connections between the Old Testament and the New. I mean, the Old Testament helps us to read the New Testament and vice versa. So that's what we'll keep in mind as well. And the third thing we want to always have at the front of our minds as we read this book is this: the purpose of the book. The purpose of Revelation, we recall from our earlier work in this study, is to warn believers and to encourage believers in patient endurance. That's what's going on in the first century. And so the purpose of any piece of writing is critical, and it's especially critical when we get to perplexing images like we have tonight. So we read Revelation in chapter 6 with warning and encouragement in mind. Okay, so let's get to our passage. Remember where we are in John's vision. The slain lamb has just been declared worthy to take the scroll from the hand of him who sits on the throne. And this scroll, remember, contains God's purposes for both judgment and redemption. And like a first century will that's sealed with 7 seals, it's the breaking of these seals that enacts the document's contents. So, when the Roman emperor died, for example, it was the slitting of the seals that meant the will comes into effect. And that's clearly what's happening here. The seals are opened and the action in God's scroll begins. Okay, so we ready? Hear now the word of the Lord as recorded in Revelation 6, verses 1 to 8. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. And then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And then another horse came out, a fiery red horse. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. to him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. And do not damage the oil and the wine. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Do you ever read the end of a novel while you're still reading the novel? You're still not all the way to the end? You're in the novel? Well, I do that all the time. I mean, I used to teach literature, and I've read a lot of books, and I almost always read the end of the book before I get to the end. Why? Well, I can't stand the suspense, for one thing, and I really want to know where it's all going, what I should be watching for. I want to know what it is before I get there. Well, Revelation is one book where it's very helpful to know the ending. And so tonight, we're going to get some grim pictures in our passages. And there'll be more grimness to come, I have to warn you. But we know how it all ends. And I'm going to tell you how it all ends. So the last chapter of the book. This is the great spoiler, but we need to know how it ends. And here it is. We will see God at the end of this book roll out his triumphant plan for heaven and earth finally coming together, and God making his home here on earth with us, and on an earth finally cleansed of all that is evil. So the book ends with glorious, dazzling triumph. And it's important to know this glorious end to the story because so many of these middle chapters, as I've said, will show us up close pictures of God dealing with the evil one. I mean, that old dragon can sure make for some grim reading here. But all those dark images, they're framed, we have to remember, by the picture of the one on the throne in the throne room at the beginning, and God's dazzling defeat of evil at the end. So like two bookends, these pictures of triumph contain any darkness that we'll encounter along the way. Now, we'll look at these four horsemen in a moment, okay? This will be the first four of the 7 seals that are opened. We're going to take that up tonight. But I want to start with some context first. So after the magnificent throne room vision of Revelation 4 and 5, you remember all that, we might expect chapter 6 to continue with scenes of triumph and glory. But we don't. We get pictures of woe, and it's kind of a jarring transition, a jarring shift. And so I think we have to ask, what are we to make of this jarring transition from worship to woe? What does this chapter teach us about living faithfully in a world that often seems to be unraveling? Well, let's consider that this transition from glorious worship to woe and the troubling scenes of chapter 6, let's consider that that's intentional and significant. So whether God is warning John here that God will be exposing evil, or that God is judging evil, it almost doesn't matter. The effect is the same. God warns the first century churches, and in this kind of jarring way, he warns them and us that things can get pretty bad before the end of time. And the important thing is this: God's victory, while certain, is not yet complete. That's the message to the early churches and to us. Let me put it another way. The Lamb has won the battle, but the war continues to rage, and we must not lose sight of that. The scroll must be opened, and all must be fully revealed, including the darkness. Okay, so let's talk about the four horsemen and what John sees in this vision. So when the Lamb opens the first four seals, each of those four living creatures around the throne issues a summons, and in response, four horsemen emerge, right? Each on a different colored horse and each carrying out a specific mission of destruction. The first horseman, of course, rides a white horse and he carries a bow. He's given a crown and he goes out, we're told, conquering and to conquer. Now, I'm with the camp of scholars that believes that this is not Christ himself, despite the white horse. Why? Because Christ is the Lamb opening the seals, not the one doing the destruction. So rather, this horse seems to show the spirit of conquest. Remember that impressionism? It's an impression of conquest that has plagued humanity throughout history. And the bow mentioned here may even have reminded John's first century readers of the Parthians, Rome's feared enemies from the east, who always carried bows. Might have called that up for them. And so we could say that this horseman shows us the human drive to dominate, to expand territory, and to assert power over others. Well, the second horseman rides a red horse, and he carries a great sword. He's given power to, we're told, take peace from the earth. Interesting phrase. And I quote, so that people might slay one another. I mean, what an awful picture. It's a picture of civil war, of strife, internal strife, the breakdown of social order. So when the conquest of the first horse fails to bring lasting peace, it seems violence turns inward. Communities fracture. Neighbors turn against neighbors. And the very fabric of our society tears apart. Well, as if that's not enough, the third horseman, in verses 5 and 6, he rides a black horse and he carries scales. A voice announces inflated prices, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And, some of you, probably most of you remember, a denarius is a day's wage for a laborer. And so you read that closely, this horseman clearly brings economic collapse with hyperinflation, famine, and scarcity. And interestingly, the voice adds, do not harm the oil and wine. And I read that as kind of a mocking voice, perhaps a reference to the luxuries that the wealthy managed to preserve even during times of general hardship. Well, the fourth horseman, verses 7 and 8, he rides a pale horse, the color of death, we could say, and his name is Death. Our text tells us that death and Hades are given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. Well, surely this horse shows us the ultimate consequences of human rebellion, which is death. Well, how can we understand these 4 horsemen? What do we do with them? Well, as we've said before, we go to the Bible itself, earlier references, knowing that the first century audience those who had been Jews, would have been able to call up in their minds immediately relevant passages. I mean, they're so facile with the Hebrew scriptures. And tonight, that the Old Testament reference is the book of Zechariah, chapters 1 and 6. So the book of Zechariah, in general, is a prophecy about impending doom from Babylon, one of Israel's worst enemies. And we see in chapters 1 and 6 of Zechariah these same colored horses, and they're actually treated in much more detail. Here's the connection between these two references, Old and New. In both Zechariah and Revelation 6, the horsemen are not independent agents of chaos. You got that? They're not minions of the Prince of Darkness. No, in Zechariah, the horses actually patrol the earth at God's command. They assert God's sovereign rule. And all of that is even in the midst of this impending destruction of God's people by Babylon. God is still asserting his rule, and he's doing it through these four horsemen in Zechariah. Well, likewise, in Revelation 6, although things are sounding pretty bad with these horses, and much worse, we could say, we're also told in Revelation 6 that the horsemen are permitted to do their work, such as in verse 4. And, I think that I'm reading tonight from the English Standard Version, which captures more literally, more directly than some of the other translations do. And that word is used there. It's the same idea that's reiterated in verse 8, where the horseman of death is permitted to kill only 1/4 of the earth. So the point is this: these horsemen, as bad as they are, and as bad as all the consequences they bring, they operate under divine constraint, not demonic freedom. So that's important. You got that? The horses operate under divine constraint, not demonic freedom. Now, maybe God is allowing evil to reach its full expression so that God can then fully deal with it. Now, that's one scholarly view on these horses. And the idea is that the horsemen expose the depth of the problem of evil so that the magnitude of God's solution can be properly understood. That's a good way to read it. The other camp is that the horsemen are showing God's judgment itself on the world. But I don't think you actually need to come down on one or the other, because the impression is all this destruction. We can all agree that the horsemen reveal the extent of human wickedness and the consequences of rebellion against God. And at the same time, as we've said, we're encountering here a scene where evil seems to reign, but we're reminded explicitly in Revelation 6 and through the resonances of Zechariah that God is still in control. The horsemen ultimately answer to God. Okay, so what do we do with all this? What do we do with this? How does this vision of four horsemen help us, you and me, to live faithfully in our world today? And so let me just try to summarize some truths that I think we've learned so far. And there's 3 that I'm seeing here tonight. And let me start with this. The first one: evil is real. Evil is real. In chapter 6, the horsemen show us just how deep and broad evil can be. Superficial solutions to deep problems on our planet do not bring lasting healing. And sometimes, maybe even often, We simply cannot make sense of evil in our world. You think about it. I mean, we humans, we want our world to be rational, right? We want it all to make sense. And so we encounter evil things, horrible things, a bad car accident, a betrayal at work or in a marriage or by a friend, serious illness, loss, so much of that. But so often we want to say triumphantly, well, God has his reasons for that. Well, let's not be so quick to ascribe evil to God. Why? Because God is not the author of evil. Evil is senseless. Evil is real. And yes, God works good out of evil for those he has called. We know that from the scriptures, from Romans. But so often, what we see in our world is simply what the Apostle Paul calls the law of sin and death. It just is. And I think that's what we get here. Evil is real. So why does God allow all this evil in the world, right? That's what you're asking. Why does he allow the four horsemen? Well, let me add to the list of questions. Why does he want to give humanity a chance to step in and be a force for good? In chapter 1, he's called us his priests, the ones who bridge heaven and earth, who bring his vision and his mission and his love to the world. So we do know this. We just can't sit back and be, shall we say, retreatists, right? Retreating from the world. We can't do that. He calls us to be priests, to step in and bring his mission to the world. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, I don't have profound solutions for us regarding the great evils of the world. I mean, how do we solve humanity's trust in military conquest or civil strife? What do we say and do when politics separate neighbor from neighbor and divide entire families? How do we solve the human desire to trust in kings and pharaohs and horses and conquest rather than walk the path of sacrifice? How do you and I stand for truth, but not do so with the conquest mentality of that first horse? And how do we proclaim Jesus in our own confused modern day? I don't have all the answers to those very hard questions, but I do know that God will teach us and is teaching us how to stand with the saints and to endure patiently and continue to advance his kingdom, to do good, resist evil, act kindly and mercifully and sacrificially. That's what he's called us to. In the face of the darkness, he calls us to press on, right? And we remember Jesus told his disciples to get on the ground and wash each other's feet. It's service, sacrifice, kindness, mercy. That's the way of the cross, not the triumphalism of the lion without also the vulnerability of the lamb. Remember, we talked about that last week. And so, let me say this. We can know that every small and large thing we do for God's kingdom matters. Evil is real, but also our work for God's kingdom matters. Well, the second idea I have for you, a truth that emerges from this text, just a few sentences on this because it's really related to the first. It's a little different, but related. And the second idea is this: spiritual warfare is real. So evil is real, and also spiritual warfare itself is real. So Revelation 6 reminds us that we're not dealing merely with political, economic, or social problems. Behind these earthly conflicts we see in our own day lies a deeper spiritual battle. The horsemen represent spiritual realities that manifest in material ways. Our struggle, friends, is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil. And when we wonder why evil seems so senseless, and it is, we've said that, we must also remember that spiritual warfare itself is playing out in our own time. And what's the third idea? I mean, all of that is not to scare us too badly, because we have the third idea. We have the beginning of Revelation and the end. And what was that message? It's God is still on the throne. God is still on the throne, even amidst the evil we see, amidst the spiritual warfare, and amidst the suffering. And we'll talk about suffering a little more next week with the remainder of chapter 6. But tonight, we have already observed that the horsemen operate by divine permission, not demonic authority. I mean, their destructive work serves God's ultimate purposes. Now, as we've said, this does not make God the author of evil, but it does affirm that even evil serves God's sovereign plan. So the leash on the kingdom of darkness, the prince of darkness, may be long, but it's still a leash held by the Almighty. The prince of darkness is on a leash. And, this idea, God is on the throne, we see it in our day. We see it borne out all the time in ways large and small. And let me just draw some large examples from history. Think of May 1944, a month before the Normandy invasion against the Nazis. What do you think the Christians were doing then? Weren't they huddled together, wondering if this is the end of the world as the Nazi regime marches across Europe and into France? I mean, it's terrifying. And yet, weeks later, June, the largest seaborne invasion in history takes place against the Nazis and pushes them back. And it's against all odds, against anybody's imagination that this could actually happen, right? Friends, God is on the throne. He works in mysterious ways, but he is on the throne. And likewise, another example, think of our recent pandemic. We wondered if people would keep dying. Would the people of our world ever find health? Would our loved ones continue to die and continue to suffer? And then there it was, against all odds. An amazing vaccine was developed, seemingly in record time, and it drew together physicians and public health experts from all over the world. And the pandemic subsided. Friends, the Lord is on the throne, and he intervenes in human history. I mean, one more, bubonic plague. Go back to the 4th century for that, the Black Death. I mean, people died within days of getting those boils on their body, and that plague itself wiped out, killed nearly half of the population of Europe. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, here in Great Bridge, Chesapeake, half of the town gone over the course of a few years. I mean, that's what was happening. And what ended the plague? Well, no one actually really knows. Somehow, God intervened. And to this day, we don't even know why exactly the bubonic plague ended. It was probably a combination of factors. The point is, God did intervene, and God is on the throne. God restrains evil. And so, friends in Christ, the horsemen may ride, but the Lamb has already won. That's what we remember. The Lamb has already won. The cosmic upheaval may terrify the wicked, but it also heralds the coming of the one who will make all things new. Our task is to trust God's sovereignty, remain faithful to our calling as priests who advance his kingdom and work his mission in this world. And our calling is to eagerly await the day that Christ returns with patient endurance, and work for his kingdom. So worthy is the Lamb who was slain. To him be glory and honor and power forever and ever. Amen.